All right, let's get into it. We're going to unpack this really fantastic analysis by William L. Weaver called The Times New Roman Standard. And honestly, it's a story about what seems like a tiny, boring, bureaucratic decision that actually reveals this huge clash between modern ideas and old-school practical efficiency. And it all comes down to this one kind of crazy question. Why on earth did the U.S. State Department, one of the most powerful organizations on the planet, basically declare war over a font? It sounds completely ridiculous, right? But the answer pulls back the curtain on some really deep-seated ideas we have about technology, cost, and what it actually means for something to be accessible to everyone. So here's the thing that makes this whole story so wild: how fast it all happened. In 2023, there was this big official switch to the font Calibri. But then just 2 years later, that entire decision gets thrown out the window and the department goes right back to Times New Roman. This super quick flip-flop is exactly what prompted this whole analysis in the first place. You just have to ask, what went so wrong so quickly? Now, to really get the conflict here, you've got to meet our two main characters. On one side, you have Times New Roman. It's the classic, right? Born way back in 1931 for newspapers. It's got those little feet on the letters. Those are called serifs. Then on the other side, you've got Calibri. It's the modern kid. Born in 2007, designed specifically for computer screens. It's clean, no serifs. One was built for paper, the other was built for pixels. Okay, so to understand why this all fell apart, we have to go back to the beginning. Let's look at the modernization mandate and really dig into why they even made this change in the first place. It all kicked off with something called the 2023 Directive. Secretary Blinken's office issued this mandate for the whole department to switch over to Calibri. And the official reason they gave? It was a big one: improving accessibility. And the specific theory behind this was pretty interesting. The core idea was that sans-serif fonts like Calibri, help reduce something called visual crowding. The thinking was that this would make documents way easier to read for people with dyslexia or other visual impairments. A very noble goal for sure. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some random memo about fonts. It was positioned as part of the government's much bigger diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, or DEIA initiatives. So the stated goals were super clear: make things more readable for those with visual impairments, and at the same time, modernize the whole look and feel of government paperwork. But as you can probably guess, that really well-intentioned plan ran into some serious and pretty unexpected problems. And that brings us to the unintended consequences, all of the hidden costs that came with this new standard. So, the first huge problem is something we can call the digital handcuffs. By forcing everyone to use a font that's owned by a private company, the State Department, maybe without even realizing it, created massive risks for the future for accessing and preserving its own records. And here's where the rubber really meets the road. See, Calibri is proprietary software. It's owned by Microsoft. That creates what's called vendor lock-in. If you try to open a document on a computer that doesn't have a Microsoft license, like say a machine running Linux, the font just gets swapped out for something else, and the whole document's formatting can completely fall apart. Times New Roman, on the other hand, is a universal standard. Even if you don't have the official version, basically every computer in the world has a clone that is perfectly compatible, which means your documents look exactly the same everywhere forever. Okay, so that was the digital problem, but then there was a very real, very physical one: the physical bill. It turns out that a font that's designed to look good on a glowing screen is actually incredibly wasteful when you print it on paper. This chart really says it all. Calibri's letters have these thick, uniform lines, so they look sharp on a screen, but on paper, those thick lines just drink up ink and toner. Now, Times New Roman was engineered back in the 30s for newspapers, and one of its main design goals was to be cheap to print. Its mix of thick and thin lines was specifically created to save ink. At the scale of the US government, we are talking about a massive difference in physical resources. And it wasn't just ink, it was paper too. Because Calibri's letters are just a little bit wider, documents literally get longer. A 100-page report written in Times New Roman could easily balloon by 10 pages or even more just by switching the font to Calibri. For an organization that prints millions and millions of pages, that is a staggering amount of extra paper, extra shipping weight, and extra storage space. So when you've got these huge, unforeseen costs piling up, it forces you to go back and take a hard look at the original premise. And this brings us to the universal standard. It was time to question that accessibility argument and return to what actually works. Which gets us right back to the million-dollar question: Was that whole accessibility argument the entire reason for this massive switch even correct when it came to printed documents? Well, the scientific research says, not really. A 2018 study in the Annals of Dyslexia looked at this exact issue. And their conclusion was pretty blunt. There was, quote, no improvement in reading speed or accuracy when comparing sans-serif fonts against Times New Roman. So the whole scientific foundation for the switch was, at best, pretty shaky for paper documents. In fact, other research shows that if you really want to improve readability, things like the font size and the spacing between letters and lines are way, way more important than whether the font has serifs or not. It kind of seems like they were focused on the wrong thing all along. And here's the really fascinating part. On a high-resolution piece of paper, those little feet, the serifs, they actually do a really important job. They form a strong horizontal line that acts like guide rails, helping your eye track smoothly across the page and stopping you from accidentally skipping up or down a line. This is a perfect example. Just look at this string of letters in Calibri. Can you easily tell which one is the capital I and which one is the lowercase l? It's tough. Now look at the same thing in Times New Roman. The serifs make it instantly obvious which is which. That reduces the amount of work your brain has to do. It's just clearer. So what's the final verdict here? Well, this whole thing isn't really about which font looks nicer or about tradition versus modernity. It's about making an engineer's decision, looking at the problem from a purely logical systems perspective. And when you lay it all out on a final scorecard like this, the answer becomes pretty obvious. For print efficiency, saving ink and paper, Times New Roman is superior. For universal compatibility, making sure it works everywhere forever, it's superior. And for readability in print, the data shows they're basically equivalent, with Times New Roman even having a slight edge in telling characters apart. The choice is pretty clear-cut. So the final determination was that switching back to Times New Roman was simply the logical choice. It aligns perfectly with what the State Department actually needs, saving resources and creating official records that are standardized, permanent, and accessible to anyone, anywhere, on any device. The switch to Calibri, in the end, was a well-meaning experiment that just failed to account for the physical realities of the job. And this whole saga really leaves us with a bigger question to chew on. Fonts are one of those invisible standards we almost never think about. But this choice had these huge hidden consequences for money, resources, and even true accessibility. So it makes you wonder, what other invisible standards in your life might be having a similar, massive impact that you don't even see?